Welcome back, Netrunner fans, to part 7 of my core set retrospective, in which I'm looking back at the core set from the perspective of 2015 and the things that we know about the game today. If you haven't had a chance to check out the other parts of the series, I'd recommend doing so. There might be some ideas that I talk about in this video that are from one of the older parts of the series. I'm not going to fully explain them here. This video is going to be a little bit different because we're going to be looking at all of the neutral cards that were on both sides of the game. And before we begin, I think it's important to preface with an aspect of the core set that I haven't really spent a lot of time talking about. The core set is a really good introduction for new players to Netrunner, and one of the big reasons for that is that the core set has this pre-constructed deck model that provides a really good out-of-the-box experience just with a single core set. Basically, all you have to do is pick a faction and then shuffle the neutral cards corresponding to your side into all of that faction's cards, and you end up with a playable and tournament-legal deck. This puts a lot of weight on the neutral cards, though, and in this video, my criticism is going to largely keep in mind this out-of-the-box play experience. We want the neutral cards to be as universally playable and solid as possible, and some of these suggestions are ways that I would tweak the neutral cards for a future edition of the core set. We're going to start off with the runner cards, and the first one that we have is Infiltration. I brought this card up earlier when we were talking about the criminal cards, and this to me really just seems like a criminal effect, and I think would have been better in the criminal card pool, and replaced with something more general use, like Easy Mark. Infiltration's always been a pretty metagame dependent card, and it seems kind of strange to me that it would be mixed into these starter decks, these first pre-constructed sort of decks, that you would play against just any generic faction. A new player is not going to know that Infiltration's a lot stronger against Jinteki, and it got a lot weaker against decks that don't play traps. So to me, it just seems like it would have been better if a really generic and stronger economic effect like Easy Mark was just included in those basic decks. Next up is likely the most played card on the runner side of the game, period, and that's Sure Gamble. Runner and Corpse saw this early symmetry with both of them having access to an effect that was essentially 5 for 9, and I think this was a really good choice. We need to have burst economy cards in the core set, and it makes a lot of sense that they picked one that has kind of a steep initial cost. Both Sure Gamble and Hedge Fund were reprints from the original game, and it was a really good choice to start off the economies of both sides of the game with this sort of equal footing. Next up, we have the first of the AI breakers, and that's Crypsis. This saw a lot of play in early Netrunner, and has certainly fallen off as we've seen more powerful and more specialized AI breakers, especially out of the Anarch faction. But this was a great introduction for new players to the concept of AI breakers. The fact that it can break anything, but it's really inefficient, has low initial strength, and it has a drawback that's click intensive. So overall, this was a pretty great design. Next up is the absolute stinker from the runner side, and that is access to Global Sec. This card sucks, and is definitely one of the worst cards in the core set. It's not worth the 1 install cost, and Link has just never been all that well rewarded. Now, like I said when we were talking about Rabbit Hole, I think that might be changing, but that's like with the newest releases in 2015, we're starting to see some new ideas with Link. So there's been this period since release where Link has just never been that good, and there's certainly never been much of an incentive to play this card. I don't really see any way to fix this card without basically creating an entirely different card that just happens to have Link. I would have just rather seen some other good economy effect in the core set. And my pick nowadays would be something like Katie Jones. She's been a huge staple in a lot of runner decks, and I think it would just be good to have this sort of persistent economy effect in the core set. The last runner card is Armitage Code Busting. This is sort of like a short-term magnum opus that's also cheaper to install both in terms of cost and MU. And this card has seen a fair amount of play throughout Netrunner's history. Like with a lot of these core set economy effects, this saw way more play in early Netrunner than it does in modern Netrunner, where we have a lot more choices. But that doesn't mean it's a bad design. I like this card quite a bit because it's one of the few really cheap ways to get yourself into a moderate number of credit range, and I just think that this card has worked pretty well in the decks that have been able to use it. Probably my only complaint is one that I've mentioned several times, which is that the job subtype was never utilized, and that would have been a really great way to distinguish Armitage from some of the other lower end economy effects. Now we're going to move over to the corp side of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the two agendas. Now, the important thing to point out about the agendas is that all of the pre-constructed decks on the corp side include 3 copies of both of these agendas. So it's really important that these neutral agendas provide a solid foundation on which to build your corp deck, and as we're about to talk about, I don't really think they do. First up is Priority Requisition. This is the quintessential 5-for-3. I think it's what most people think of when they think of large agendas, and generally speaking, I think this card has worked out pretty well. Its 5-for-3 effect is powerful, maybe not quite as strong as it needs to be, but it's definitely on the level of good enough. And I think that the only problem with this card, the only thing that's really held back its playability, has been general problems with 5-for-3s and the ability to create scoring remotes. Especially early on in Netrunner, the only way that you could build a scoring remote was putting a bunch of ice there, and like I've talked about extensively, some of the icebreakers in the core set are too high power level and need to kind of be ramped down to make scoring remotes and just defense with ice a little more viable. This was basically a direct reprint, and I think it was a good choice for the 5-for-3 in the core set. We've seen a lot of bad 5-for-3s, and luckily the one in the core set is not among them. Next up is the 4-for-2, which was Private Security Force. This thing sucks, and I think is a huge reason why the pre-con decks aren't really that balanced. I've heard a lot of people say that the Corp has a lot of trouble defending just out of the core set, and I think this has something to do with that. This is really just not a very good 4-for-2 to have in the core set. It has a specialized effect that could maybe work in a deck that could get them tagged, but like we just talked about in the NBN video, if you're going to get the runner tagged, you might as well just blow them up with Scorched Earth, and playing something like this doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think it would have made a lot better sense to reprint a different 4-for-2 in this slot, especially one that had a more universal and economic focused effect, something that just any deck could use. My pick from those old 4-for-2s would have to be Political Coup, which is basically just when you score it, you put 12 credits on it, then you can click it and you get 3 credits from it. This would just be a nice economy effect for a huge number of decks, and it would not only make those early, like just core set, pre-con type decks a lot stronger because they'd have a more general use 4-for-2, they wouldn't have to rely on tags, but it'd also just be a pretty decent card all around for Glacier. I think that an economy 4-for-2 agenda is something that the game really needs more of. Next, we have this section of the Corp cards that were the economy effects, and all around I'm really happy with these. The first one that we have is Melange Mining Corp. This was basically a direct reprint. They made it a little bit better, and this card has seen quite a bit of play in a variety of decks. If you can make a remote server that you can defend this card, you're going to make a lot of money with it. And I love how with this card, there's kind of this inevitability type thing where if the runner can't get into that server and can't deal with your mining corp, you can just sit there and click it for 1,000,000 credits. And once you get up to like 40 credits or whatever, then you've kind of got enough that you can res all the ice you're going to need for the rest of the game. You're just in a much more comfortable economic position. So I think in a way that not all of the economy assets do this, Melange Mining Corp really forces the runner to interact and really forces them to have a way to get into your remote, deal with your ice, and trash this stupid thing. Next up is Pad Campaign. I was a bit surprised to learn that this was not a direct reprint. I mean, there were lots of cards in original Netrunner that had this same basic idea, where it's some asset that gives you credits over time. But this one is permanent. It's going to always give you 1 credit every turn until the runner trashes it. It doesn't run out of credits like we see with some other economy effects, especially on the runner side. This was a good design. I think that the 2 for 4 sort of thing has been a model that a lot of other assets have been designed on. Reses for 2, trashes for 4. Seems like about the baseline for like good quality assets. Pads have seen a lot of play for their drip economy, and we've seen a lot of Pad Campaign clones in a variety of factions, so it's pretty easy to play kind of 6 Pad Campaign effects in a lot of decks. And we're seeing more and more of that, especially with Near Earth Hub and things like that being so popular. The last economy card was Hedge Fund. This card's seen play in basically every deck, and there's really not a whole lot to say about it. This card's good. It was a really good choice. Like I said, with Sure Gamble, having this large cost burst effect was a good choice. And the transaction thing has been semi-relevant. I'm going to talk about that more in my Wayland video, so I'm going to hold off some of the commentary on this card. The last 3 cards are the neutral ice that were in the core set. And I want to quickly reiterate that the way that we build these pre-con decks is we shuffle all of the neutral cards into our faction of choice. So the economy effects that we just looked at, those provide a really nice foundation for basically any deck's economy. Now you're going to have to play a few more economy cards, but all of those cards are so general use that they're going to make sense in quite a few decks. So there's a lot of pressure on the ice to be kind of the same, where they work in basically every deck. And I think that they've largely succeeded at that with these ice, but there's one that certainly doesn't work that way. First up is Enigma. This is sort of an original design, believe it or not, and it's such a generically good piece of ice that it still sees a lot of play today. The thing that's so great about this is that it not only has a hard end of the run subroutine, but it has this anti-face check sort of subroutine where if the runner just runs to try to get you to res your ice, you can at least punish them by making them lose a click. And the only way they can really avoid that is by running last click, which is largely not an advisable play against a lot of decks. I think the value of Enigma has increased a lot over time. Earlier in Netrunner, this card was just constantly getting annihilated by Yogg, and as Yogg has fallen out of favor for a variety of reasons, this card has definitely gained a lot more playability and is just a lot more high value ice. We've definitely seen this as an alternative to some of the other end the run code gates because of its survivability against Parasite and the fact that it has this extra subroutine that punishes the runner. I definitely see a lot of Enigmas even to this day, and this was just a really solid neutral end the run piece of ice that still sees a lot of play and was just a good design. Next up is the Sentry in the mix, and that's Hunter. This card really just doesn't make any sense as a neutral piece of ice that you're going to be including in all of the pre-con decks. I think one of the big ideas that they got wrong about tags was that most decks would want to or would be willing to include tag effects just to deal with resources. And I think that for the most part, that's just not the case. A lot of runner decks can limp by without resources, especially if they're saving the credits that they would need to break tag ice like this. This card would have been much more well-suited just in NBN or Wayland, just as another piece of decent ice. I think this is an okay idea with the huge strength, the tracing subroutine, but this to me just seems way more like an NBN piece of ice than it is a neutral one. I would have liked to see a Sentry that had the potential to end the run, even if it was associated with a trace, but then also had more subroutines to kind of set the precedent of Sentries being about having lots of subroutines just in the core set. I've taken the liberty to invent a piece of ice that I would have liked to see as a replacement here. It has kind of an economic subroutine of the corp may shuffle a card from HQ or archives into your deck. This will let you get back your hedge funds and stuff, but it would also help with things like agenda flood early in the game. Something like this, just a bunch of subroutines, end the run, piece of Century Ice, would have been much more well suited than some sort of tag effect, and I'm not really sure why they chose to put Hunter in the neutral slot. That seems like such a precious slot of the core set. The last piece of ice was good old Wall of Static. Unfortunately, I don't think this really sees play much at all anymore, but this was a really solid inclusion in the core set. This is just a good end-the-run piece of ice. I think virtually every deck was playing this early in Netrunner, and I think it's relatively recently that we started to ditch this, as we've had more in-faction barriers that are in this cost range. An interesting thing to note is that this is a reprint, but they actually buffed it. The original version only had 2 strength, and it seems to me like this was a good choice if they were going to go with something like Corroder as the main way to deal with barriers. This was always a little bit of a tax for Corroder, and it definitely justifies the 3 res cost a lot more with that 3 strength. That's going to do it for my look back at the neutral cards in the core set. Overall, I think they got a ton of things right about this. Most of the effects are very generic, they're very playable and everything, and I think that was a really, really good choice. It made this pre-con thing work out really well. The only exceptions are the few specialized neutral effects, like access to GlobeSec and Private Security Force and Hunter. I'm not really sure why those were included in the neutral stuff. If those were replaced with more generically good cards, more just solid economy effects, or just overall more playable stuff, I think that would have made the core set neutral cards absolutely perfect. As it is, they did an exemplary job, and I think one of the big reasons why this out-of-the-box playability works with the core set is because they made a lot of really good choices with the card selection in this neutral section. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please click subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up. And we have one more part of this series, the Wayland one. I should have that out pretty soon, so I'll see you over there.